There are men who walk among us, their dreams buried so deep, you'd think they never had any at all. Men who punch the clock, day in, day out, their lives unfolding like a well-worn blueprint, predictable as the sunrise. You see them, you nod, you pass them by, never guessing the quiet wars raging inside their heads. They carry the weight of invisible battles, the heavy burden of what-ifs and could-haves, tucked away behind a tired smile or a steady gaze. This ain't a story about a hero born with a silver spoon or a genius who stumbled onto a miracle. Nah, this is about a man you might have worked beside, stood next to in line at the hardware store, or seen just driving by in his beat-up pickup. A man who learned that the real treasure map wasn't to some hidden gold, but to the uncharted territory inside himself. His name was Roy, 48 years old, and every one of them felt etched into the lines around his eyes. He worked at the plant, the same plant for 20-odd years, a steady hand on the assembly line, building widgets no one ever thought much about except that they had to work. Roy wasn't the kind of man who drew attention. He was the kind you'd glance at and then forget, a part of the dependable background hum of the world, like the subtle thrumming of a well-oiled machine. His face, weathered by years of fluorescent lights and the subtle grit of factory air, held a permanent quietness. It wasn't sadness, not exactly, but a kind of deep-set patience, like a stone worn smooth by a tireless river. You could read a lifetime of honest labor in his hands. Knuckles swollen, fingers thick, the skin cross-hatched with old scars and perpetually stained with a faint, stubborn grease that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. These were working hands, hands that knew the feel of cold steel and vibrating machinery, hands that had provided. Beneath the brim of his faded baseball cap, his eyes, a muted blue, held a peculiar blend of weariness and watchful stillness. They seemed to take everything in, quietly observing the world around him, rarely betraying much of what churned beneath. He moved with the practiced economy of a man who'd done the same motions thousands of times. Each step, each lift, each twist of a bolt, a silent testament to years spent earning a living, one shift at a time. On the surface, Roy was a man content to fade. He didn't complain much, not out loud anyway. He'd just nod, sometimes offer a small, almost imperceptible shrug, and keep on. Most folks probably figured he was just happy enough, another cog in the machine, quietly turning. But if you looked closer, if you knew how to read the faint flicker in those tired eyes, you might catch a glimpse of something else, something restless. Something that yearned for more than the predictable rhythm of the factory floor. He had a deep-seated ambition, tucked away like a forgotten letter in an old chest. A fear, too, a fear of being overlooked, of reaching the end of the line having left no mark, having built nothing beyond what the company paid him to build. And underneath it all, a quiet, stubborn determination. A hope unwavering despite the years that maybe, just maybe, there was a different path, a better future waiting to be forged. He just didn't know how to start chipping away at the stone of his own self-doubt. He just didn't know how to start chipping away at the stone of his own self-doubt. Every day began the same. A jarring electronic chirp from the cheap alarm clock on the nightstand at precisely 5 o'clock. Not 5:01, not 5:02, 5. The air in their small, neat bungalow on the older side of town always held a faint chill at that hour, regardless of the season, a quiet reminder of the world still asleep. Roy would swing his legs out of bed, the floorboards creaking a familiar lament beneath his weight, and head for the kitchen. Sarah, his wife, would often stir, sometimes letting out a soft grunt, but she knew the drill. This was Roy's time. He'd put on a pot of coffee, a dark, strong brew that promised a jolt but often only delivered a mild hum. While it dripped, he'd toast a slice of bread, maybe spread a thin layer of jelly, and stand by the window watching the pre-dawn sky slowly lighten, paint itself in bruised purples and grays. He'd think about the day ahead, not with excitement, but with a kind of weary resignation. Another day on the line. Another 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours of the same deafening clatter, the same repetitive movements, the same metallic tang in the air. His commute was short, a 15-minute drive in his beat-up sedan that smelled faintly of stale coffee and machine oil. He knew every pothole, every crack in the pavement, knew the exact rhythm of the traffic lights. When he pulled into the factory parking lot, it was usually still half empty, the earliest birds already inside, punching in. The factory floor was a beast, a vast cavern of concrete and steel, alive with the incessant hum of machinery, the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of hydraulic presses. Roy worked the assembly line, a familiar station he'd occupied for nearly 20 years. His job was to fit a specific component onto the main chassis of whatever they were building that month, a pump, a valve, a specialized bracket. He could do it blindfolded, his hands moving with an automatic precision born of countless repetitions. Twist, push, bolt, twist, push, bolt. The motion was engraved into his muscle memory, a part of him as much as his own heartbeat. His days blurred into weeks and weeks into months, marked only by the shifting seasons outside the factory's grimy windows or the occasional holiday bonus that never quite stretched far enough. Payday was always a relief, quickly followed by the familiar anxiety of juggling bills. Mortgage, utilities, car payment, groceries, Emily's college tuition, David's school trips, new shoes. It felt like a constant game of Tetris trying to fit too many blocks into too small a space. He never complained, not really. What was there to complain about? He had a job, a steady paycheck, food on the table, a roof over their heads. Most guys would kill for that kind of stability. Yet beneath the veneer of contentment, a dull ache persisted. It was the ache of potential unrealized, of dreams deferred so long they felt like other people's memories. Late at night, after Sarah and the kids were asleep, Roy would sometimes sit in the dimly lit living room, a cold coffee mug in his hand, and pore over the bills. His brow furrowed, a pen tapped against the worn wood of the coffee table. He'd calculate, recalculate, trying to find a few extra dollars here, a few less there. The numbers rarely balanced the way he wanted them to. There was always more month than money. He'd look at the college expenses for Emily, a smart girl with a bright future he was determined to provide, and David, already dreaming of being an engineer, sketching elaborate contraptions in his notebooks. Roy loved them fiercely, but their ambitions, their needs, felt like an ever-present weight on his shoulders. He didn't just want to provide, he wanted to inspire. He wanted to show them that life wasn't just about punching a clock until you retired. But what could he show them? What had he built? What dreams had he chased? He saw himself reflected in the polished surface of the old television screen. Just another guy on the line, ordinary, lacking any special talent. His potential, he believed, was capped by his circumstances, by the life he'd settled into. This belief was a quiet poison, festering in the dark corners of his mind, whispering that he was destined for nothing more, that this was simply his lot in life. He wanted to be an inventor once, a creator, but those youthful aspirations had long since been buried under the relentless demands of responsibility and routine. The man he was, and the man he'd once dreamed of becoming, felt miles apart, separated by an unbridgeable chasm of time and missed opportunities. And that gap, that agonizing space between his present reality and his buried aspirations, haunted him more than any bill. It was the deepest cut. Every weekday, the blare of his alarm at 5 a.m. was less a wake-up call and more a summons to another day identical to the last. The old clock radio on his nightstand, its plastic yellowed with age, chirped its insistent tune, dragging him from the fleeting peace of sleep. He'd swing his feet to the worn linoleum, the chill seeping through his thick socks, and begin the silent ritual. Coffee first, black and strong enough to strip paint, standing at the kitchen counter, watching the gray pre-dawn light bleed reluctantly into the sky. Sarah would stir a little later, getting ready for her part-time job at the library, their morning exchange a practiced choreography of quiet movements and soft murmurs. The drive to the factory was always the same. The same stretch of highway, the same early risers in their beat-up trucks, the same faint metallic tang in the air as he neared the plant. Inside, the rhythmic clatter of machinery was a constant companion, a deafening symphony that had become the soundtrack to his life. Day in, day out, he performed his task on the assembly line, hands moving with an efficiency born of 2 decades of repetition. Fastening, welding, checking, lifting. His body knew the motions, a quiet automaton responding to the demands of the clock, the conveyor belt, the foreman's sharp glance. His mind, though, often drifted. Sometimes it was to the grocery list, sometimes to the upcoming car repair bill, but mostly it was to the vast, empty space where his younger self's ambitions used to live. He'd look at the gleaming parts rolling past, components of some larger machine, and a flicker of the old inventor's spark would try to ignite. He knew these parts, knew their strengths and weaknesses, their tolerances. He understood the mechanics of how things fit together, how they worked. But then the thought would vanish, smothered by the relentless pace of the line, by the grim reality that he was just a cog in someone else's grand design, not the architect of his own. Evenings offered little reprieve. Dinner with Sarah, Emily, and David was the anchor of his day, a brief oasis of family warmth. He'd listen to Emily talk about her college courses, her youthful optimism a stark contrast to his own quiet weariness. David would sometimes show him a new sketch, an idea for a robot arm or a better way to launch a paper airplane. When David's face lit up describing some complex gear mechanism, Roy felt a peculiar mix of pride and a sharp, aching pang of regret. He saw the fire in his son's eyes, a fire that had long since dwindled to embers within himself. He'd nod, offer a simple, "That's good, son," but inside the words caught in his throat. What advice could he truly give about pursuing dreams when he hadn't pursued his own? Later, after the kids were in bed, the house grew quiet, amplifying the persistent hum of the refrigerator and the quiet anxieties that buzzed in Roy's head. He and Sarah would sit in the living room, the muted glow of the television casting long shadows. Sometimes they'd talk about bills, the rising cost of everything, the tightrope walk of making ends meet. Other times they'd sit in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Roy, this was often when the deepest cut throbbed the most. He'd look around their small, neat bungalow, every fixture a testament to careful budgeting and a lifetime of hard work. It was a good home, well-maintained, but it felt like a cage sometimes, a beautiful, comfortable cage built from all his forgotten ambitions. He wanted to be a man who built things, not just assembled them, a man who created. But the years had blurred those lines, erased the blueprints. He saw himself as ordinary, lacking any special talent or drive that would set him apart. The fear of being overlooked, of merely being a placeholder in the grand scheme of things, was a constant, dull ache beneath his steady exterior. He internalized every criticism, every unspoken doubt about his capabilities, letting it solidify the self-imposed limits that bound him. He often struggled to articulate his bigger visions, not just to others, but even to himself, convinced they were foolish, impractical, the stuff of youth. This quiet determination he possessed, so unshakable on the surface, had for too long been turned against himself, ensuring he never strayed from the well-worn path, keeping his grander aspirations buried deep, unspoken, and unfulfilled. It was a Tuesday night late. The kind of late that feels less like the end of a day and more like the beginning of a new, equally exhausting one. Roy had just stumbled in from a double shift. 12 hours on the line, the metallic tang of the factory floor still clinging to his clothes, the hum of machinery a phantom vibration in his bones. His shoulders ached, a deep, persistent throb from repetitive motion, and his mind felt sluggish, coated in a layer of industrial dust. Sarah was already asleep, a faint light escaping from Emily's room where she was likely studying, but David, his 15-year-old, was still hunched over the kitchen table. Textbooks splayed open, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside a diagram of a complicated engine part. "Still at it, bud?" Roy asked, his voice rough with fatigue, trying to summon a smile that felt alien to his tired face. David looked up, his brow furrowed, a frustration that mirrored Roy's own etched on his young features. "Yeah, Dad, this geometry is killing me. And then I've got this essay on what I want to do with my life." He pushed a hand through his hair, a gesture Roy recognized as his own. "It's dumb. Like, how am I supposed to know?" Roy walked over, leaned against the counter, the cool laminate a small comfort against his overheated skin. He looked at the blueprint for David's future, metaphorical and literal, spread out on the table. David was bright, curious, full of unformed ideas and nascent dreams. He wanted to build things, real things, not just assemble what someone else had designed. The words stuck in Roy's throat, a bitter lump. What could he say? Follow your dreams, son? What a joke. He, Roy, who had meticulously buried every dream he'd ever had under layers of practical concern and quiet resignation, had no business offering such advice. He taught his son consistency, the value of hard work, the importance of a steady paycheck. But dreams? He was an empty well on that front. He looked at David, really looked at him, and saw not just a boy struggling with homework, but a mirror reflecting his own younger self, full of unanswered questions, brimming with potential that had, in Roy's case, withered on the vine. The thought stung, sharp and immediate, cutting through the fatigue. He mumbled something about taking a break, about sleep, and retreated to the bathroom, the fluorescent light a stark glare against the grime of his day. He splashed cold water on his face, scrubbing away the grease and fatigue, but the feeling remained. He lifted his head, eyes meeting his own reflection in the steamed-up mirror. 48 years old, a factory worker, a good man, a decent provider, sure. But there was something else in those tired eyes beneath the weariness and the steady gaze, a flicker of something lost. A man who had let himself become ordinary, who had accepted his lot as just another guy on the line. He saw the fear of being overlooked, the quiet acceptance of an unfulfilled potential. He saw a man who had for too long forgotten how to dream, let alone pursue one. And in that precise moment, standing there, damp and exhausted, a profound, undeniable wave of self-pity washed over him, hot and thick. It mixed with a deep, searing frustration, not at David, not at Sarah, not at his job, but at himself. He couldn't live like this anymore. He couldn't stand there looking at that reflection, knowing that when his son asked for advice on pursuing dreams, he had nothing but platitudes because he hadn't pursued his own. He couldn't let his potential just rust away. He had to prove something, not to anyone else, not for a promotion, not for more money, but to himself. For his family, yes, to show them what was possible, but more than that, for the man staring back at him in the mirror. He just couldn't. Not one more day. The house fell silent, save for the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Roy, however, found no peace in the quiet. He lay beside Sarah, listening to her soft, even breathing, the rhythm of a person truly at rest. His own mind was a frantic kaleidoscope of the day's indignities, David's question, and that searing moment in the mirror. He tried to close his eyes, tried to will himself into oblivion, but the thoughts were relentless, sharp-edged, and unforgiving. He slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Sarah, and padded barefoot into the living room. The digital clock on the cable box glowed 3:17 a.m. That wretched hour when doubts bloom like weeds in the dark, when all the carefully constructed facades of the day crumble, leaving nothing but raw truth. He sank onto the old armchair, the worn fabric familiar against his skin, and stared into the darkness. What had his life become? He had a good wife, healthy kids, a roof over their heads. He was, by most accounts, a success in the quiet, unassuming way of the blue-collar worker. But tonight, that wasn't enough. Tonight, the brutal honesty of the 3 a.m. quiet pierced through all the justifications and compromises he'd made over the years. He thought of the younger Roy, full of sketches and ideas, convinced he'd invent something, build something that would change things, even just a little. That young man, so full of unarticulated fire, would barely recognize the Roy of today. He'd laugh, probably a harsh, disappointed sound. "This is it, Roy? This is all you amounted to? Another gear in the machine?" Shame coiled in his gut, thick and sour. He had settled. He had stopped asking questions, stopped pushing. He had let the fear of failure, the fear of looking foolish, the fear of not being good enough, slowly, meticulously pave over his ambition. He told himself it was about responsibility, about providing, and it was, in part. But hadn't he also used it as an excuse, a comfortable cage to hide his own lack of nerve? The worst part wasn't the hard work, or the long hours, or even the bills that always seemed to pile up faster than he could pay them down. The worst part was the quiet, insidious erosion of self-belief. The way he had bought into the idea that his potential was capped by his circumstances, that his destiny was written in the factory schedule, punched in and out day after day until retirement. He saw himself not as a man who couldn't do more, but as a man who had, for whatever reason, chosen not to. And that choice, made 1,000 times over in tiny, imperceptible surrenders, felt heavier than any double shift. He swallowed hard, the bitterness of that realization catching in his throat. He had to change. He just had to. He didn't know how or what, but the quiet desperation was now a roaring fire in his chest. That roar, though, was a caged animal pacing its small, familiar territory. It needed a crack, a fissure in the rock of his resignation, for the beast to truly break free. And that crack came, as these things often do, not in a moment of dramatic upheaval, but in the quiet, crushing weight of an ordinary Tuesday night. He pulled another double. His third that week. 12 hours at the press, then another 8 on the late shift, checking tolerances, hefting raw materials. His body felt like a bag of wet cement, each joint a rusty hinge. The drive home was a blur of tail lights and the rhythmic thrum of his worn-out tires on the asphalt. He saw the glow of the living room lamp as he pulled into his driveway, a beacon in the dark, and for a split second he felt a wave of relief. Home, rest. But as he pushed open the front door, the weariness curdled into a fresh wave of exhaustion. David, his 15-year-old, was still up, hunched over the kitchen table, a calculus textbook spread open, his brow furrowed in frustration. Empty ramen cup beside him. Sarah, bless her heart, had tried to help, no doubt, but geometry was her limit, and calculus felt like a foreign language to both of them. Roy dropped his lunch pail with a clatter that sounded too loud in the quiet house. David jumped, startled, then looked up, his young face etched with an unfamiliar mix of anger and despair. "Dad, you're home. Can you just look at this? I don't get it. None of it. What's the point, anyway?" He gestured wildly at the equations, a jumble of numbers and symbols that might as well have been hieroglyphics. "What good is learning this stuff if you don't even go for your dreams?" Like, what's the point of knowing all this if you just end up doing something you don't even care about? The words hung in the air, sharper than any factory whistle. Roy's gut twisted. He looked at his son, whose eyes, so full of youthful frustration and unasked questions about the future, suddenly seemed to mirror the young man Roy used to be. A profound shame washed over him. What could he tell him? Just keep working hard, son. It felt like a lie, hollow and hypocritical. He knew the answer David needed wasn't about the quadratic formula. It was about the formula for a meaningful life. And Roy, at that moment, felt like he didn't have even the first variable. He mumbled something about persistence, about sticking with it, even when it was hard. But the words tasted like ash, and David just slumped back in his chair, defeated, looking more disappointed than angry now. Roy watched his son push the book away, his shoulders slumped. He felt a sudden, profound disconnect. He was supposed to be the pillar, the one with the answers, the guide. But what wisdom could he offer about pursuing dreams when he hadn't pursued his own? He felt like a fraud, a cardboard cutout of the man he was supposed to be. He mumbled a good night, the words catching in his throat, and retreated to the bathroom. He splashed cold water on his face, then stared at his reflection in the steamed-up mirror. The man looking back at him was Roy, yes, but a stranger too. The weary eyes, the lines etched by worry and routine, the faint smell of grease and metal clinging to his skin. He saw not just a tired man, but a man who had stopped dreaming. A man who had traded his potential for predictable comfort, his ambition for apathy. The roaring fire, from earlier, that quiet desperation for change, found its fuel in David's innocent, cutting question. It ignited not just in his chest, but in his very bones. He couldn't live like this anymore. He wouldn't. Not for himself, and certainly not for his kids. Later, much later, the house was silent. 3 a.m., the kind of silence that amplifies every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind against the windows. Roy lay in bed, Sarah breathing softly beside him, her presence a comforting weight, yet also a stark reminder of the lie he'd been living. He couldn't sleep. He hadn't been able to since David's question had landed like a fist to his gut. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and padded barefoot to the kitchen. The linoleum was cool beneath his feet. He poured a glass of water, the clink of ice cubes echoing in the quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where David had been wrestling with calculus hours earlier, the moonlight slicing through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. He held the cold glass, feeling its chill spread through his palm. He replayed the day, the week, the last decade. He saw all the some days he'd promised himself, the one days that had turned into nevers. He thought about Emily away at college, chasing her dreams, a life of possibilities opening up before her. What example was he setting for them? A good provider, yes, always. He'd always made sure there was food on the table, a roof over their heads. But what else? Was he truly living? Or just existing, a ghost in his own life? The brutal honesty of the pre-dawn hours settled over him like a shroud. He saw the comfortable cage he'd built, brick by brick, with excuses. He saw the dreams he'd buried, thinking they were impractical, childish, out of reach for a man like him. He saw the fear he'd allowed to dictate his path, fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of standing out. He saw the man he was, and the vast, aching canyon between that man and the man he knew he could be, the man he should have been. A profound sense of loneliness washed over him, not because he was physically alone in the house, but because he was alone with his unfulfilled potential, his silent regrets. He felt the weight of all those thousands of small surrenders, those tiny concessions that had paved his path to quiet desperation. The shame was a living thing in his gut, burning, twisting. He'd become complacent. He'd become invisible even to himself. He couldn't just brush this off anymore. This wasn't just a bad day or a particularly grueling double shift. This was his life unfolding before him, and he didn't like the direction it was going. He was tired of being just Roy. He was tired of the quiet erosion of his own spirit. He was done. He was done. The words echoed in the silence of his mind, not a roar, but a deep, resonant hum, like a tuning fork struck true. It settled into his bones, a new kind of certainty replacing the lifelong resignation. Done with the quiet desperation. Done with the ghost he'd become in his own life. There was no sudden flash of a grand plan, no blueprint laid out before him on the kitchen table. Just a vast, terrifying emptiness where the old acceptance used to be, and in its place, this raw, unyielding need for something different. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know how a man who had only ever known the rhythm of a factory floor, the predictable hum of machines, could unlearn a lifetime of habit and expectation. All he knew with a clarity that stung like a slap was that he absolutely, fundamentally, could not continue down the same worn path. Not one more step. The dawn broke, gray and indifferent, painting the kitchen in the familiar hues of another workday. The alarm blared at 5:00 a.m., just like always, but this time something felt heavier, or lighter. He couldn't quite tell. The usual cascade of weariness tried to pull him back under the covers, promising the sweet oblivion of just 5 more minutes. Just 5 more minutes, Roy. What's the rush? The old voice, insidious and comforting, whispered in his ear. But this morning he heard another voice, quieter, firmer. No, he dragged himself out of bed, the aches in his back and shoulders a testament to yesterday's double shift. He went through the motions of breakfast, the quiet ritual with Sarah and the kids still asleep. But his mind was already fighting a different battle, a battle against the sheer inertia of his own life. He thought about the trigger, that moment with David, and the homework, the mirror. He thought about Emily, so bright, so full of possibilities. He thought about Sarah, who deserved a partner, not a shadow. And a small, defiant spark ignited in the cavern of his chest. The drive to the factory felt different. The men piling out of their beat-up trucks looked like reflections of his past self, weary, heading into another day. He watched them, and for the first time truly saw them, not just as co-workers, but as men caught in the same current, heading to the same shore. All day on the line, the hum of the machinery was a dull drone, but beneath it, a new rhythm was starting to beat in Roy's own head. What does it mean to master yourself? He kept coming back to that. It wasn't about being smarter than the next guy or faster. It was about something internal, something about conquering that lazy, fearful part of him that always talked him out of trying. He clocked out at 3:30 p.m., the usual exhaustion settling in. Thought of going home, eating dinner, watching TV, and collapsing into bed was overwhelmingly appealing. His body screamed for it. His mind, still raw from the pre-dawn honesty, knew better. He stopped at the public library on the way home, a place he hadn't set foot in since Emily was a little girl and wanted storybooks. The librarian, a woman with spectacles perched on her nose, looked up with mild surprise. Roy felt a blush creeping up his neck. What was he even doing here? He didn't have a plan. He just knew he had to start somewhere. He walked past the fiction, past the biographies, his worn hands running along the spines of books on business, on manufacturing, on design. He pulled out a slender volume with a plain cover. Introduction to Small Business Management. He almost put it back. This is ridiculous, Roy. You're a factory worker. What do you know about management? But the quiet no from the morning resurfaced. No. Not anymore. He checked it out, feeling foolish like a kid playing dress-up. He carried it home like it was made of fragile glass, tucking it under his arm, trying to look nonchalant as he walked through the door. After dinner, the kids were doing homework. Sarah was folding laundry. The TV was on, a ball game droning in the background. His usual spot on the couch beckoned, the remote a familiar comfort. He could feel the magnetic pull. His eyelids felt heavy, his muscles screamed for rest. He walked past the couch. He walked past the TV. He went into the small, rarely used office nook in the corner of their living room, a space usually reserved for bills and mail. He pulled up the rickety chair. He opened the book. The words swam before his eyes, paragraphs on market analysis, supply chains, profit margins. It was a foreign language. His mind drifted to the factory floor, to the easy, predictable actions he knew by heart. He caught himself staring blankly at a diagram of a business model, understanding nothing. A wave of self-doubt, thick and cold, washed over him. See, Roy, you're not cut out for this. Just go relax. He pushed back from the desk, almost giving in. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the fading light. He could hear Emily laughing, David asking Sarah for help with a math problem. He could feel the comfortable pull of his old life, the one he'd just decided he couldn't live anymore. He walked back to the desk. He sat down. He put his finger under the first sentence of the chapter, and he started reading aloud just for himself, the words catching in his throat. He forced himself to focus. He reread sentences until they made some sliver of sense. He didn't understand it all. He didn't even understand most of it. But for 30 minutes, a small, agonizing, mind-numbing 30 minutes, Roy, the factory worker, refused to quit on himself. He refused to quit mastering the first, most crucial step. Showing up. That first night, Roy didn't feel like a victor. He felt like he'd just run another double shift, only this time the labor had been in the soft, dark confines of his own skull. His eyes burned. His temples throbbed. When he finally closed the book, the clock on the wall read 9:30. Sarah had come in quietly at some point, draped a blanket over his shoulders, and whispered, "Don't work yourself too hard, honey." He just nodded, too tired to explain he hadn't been working, he'd been wrestling. The next morning, the siren song of the snooze button was louder than usual. His bed felt like a feather cloud. His pillow a promise of oblivion. Just 5 more minutes. He mumbled a bargaining chip against the nascent discipline he was trying to forge. But the image of his son struggling with that math homework, the ghost of his own unrealized potential, pricked at him. He swung his legs out of bed. Day 2, day 3 was worse. The novelty had worn thin, replaced by a dull ache in his chest every time his mind whispered, "What are you even doing?" The numbers and jargon blurred into an indistinguishable mess. He felt like a boy trying to learn calculus, only the boy was 48 and had spent his life operating heavy machinery, not dissecting balance sheets. One evening, after a particularly mind-numbing chapter on market segmentation, he felt a crushing wave of despair. He closed the book. He pushed it away. He sat there, staring at the blank wall, the television's distant drone attempting lullaby. "This is pointless, Roy. Go watch the game. Go talk to Sarah. Be normal." He didn't move for a long time. The self-doubt, his oldest companion, draped itself over him like a heavy shroud. It whispered of failure, of ridicule, of the comfort of ignorance. He remembered the feeling in his gut that night in the mirror, the raw, undeniable truth that he couldn't keep going the way he was. That memory, sharp and unyielding, was the only thing holding him in that chair. He reached out slowly and pulled the book back towards him. He didn't open it. He just rested his hand on its cover, feeling the smooth, cool texture. A silent promise. Not yet. Not today. By day 7, it was a full-blown war. Roy would come home, bone-weary, smelling of oil and sweat. Emily would be talking about college applications, David about a new video game. Sarah would ask about his day. He'd grunt out a few words, his mind already bracing for the second shift, the mental one. He'd slump onto the couch, intending just a minute of rest, and often those minutes would stretch into an hour, his eyelids heavy, his will eroding. One night he woke with a start, the remote control imprinted on his cheek, the late-night infomercial droning. Shame, hot and stinging, washed over him. He'd failed. He'd let himself slip. The old Roy had almost won. He quietly got up, his limbs stiff, and went to his little nook. He didn't feel like reading. He didn't feel like thinking. But he opened the book. He stared at the page. He was there. That was enough for that night. Just being there. The struggle was relentless. It wasn't about understanding everything. It was about the sheer, bloody-minded act of showing up. It was about facing the book even when his brain felt like a clogged drain. It was about the tiny, almost imperceptible victories. A sentence that finally made sense, a concept that clicked into place after the 5th reread, the quiet satisfaction of marking a chapter complete. These moments were rare, like finding a diamond in a mountain of coal, but they were enough to keep the embers of his hope from dying out. He started noticing patterns. The urge to quit was strongest right after a particularly difficult section, or when he was most physically tired. He learned to anticipate it, to see it for what it was. A trick of his own mind, a siren calling him back to the comfortable shores of mediocrity. He didn't always conquer it with gusto. Sometimes he just gritted his teeth, his jaw aching, and forced his eyes to move across the page. There were nights he fell asleep right at the desk, his head hitting the open book, waking with a jolt of alarm and a dull headache. But every single time, whether it was 5 minutes later or the next morning, he picked up where he left off. He refused to let a momentary lapse become an excuse for permanent surrender. Day 14 rolled around, and the weight of what he was trying to do felt immense. He'd barely scratched the surface of his first business book, let alone the others piled beside it. He looked at his hands, calloused and ingrained with grease, then at the elegant, abstract charts in the book. The gap between them seemed impossible to bridge. But then he remembered the conversation with David about dreams. He remembered his own decision, made in the harsh glare of the bathroom mirror. He remembered the quiet determination he'd sworn to himself. He was Roy, the factory worker. He was tired. He was full of doubt. But he was also Roy, the man who had promised himself he wouldn't quit. He took a deep, shaky breath and started reading again. The fight was far from over, but he was still in the ring. The ring was a lonely place sometimes. Past day 14, past day 20, the initial glow of that bathroom mirror decision started to dim, replaced by the dull ache of routine sacrifice. Roy's new schedule was a relentless taskmaster. Factory floor by day, textbooks and scattered notes by night. He started carrying a small notebook in his breast pocket, jotting down ideas during lunch breaks, sometimes even sneaking a glance at a chart during a momentary lull in the line, the hum of machinery a constant backdrop to his quiet education. Sleep became a luxury. He'd wake before the first hint of dawn, stiff and tired, the faint scent of stale coffee clinging to the kitchen air. There were mornings when just the thought of another shift, followed by another night of pushing his tired brain, felt like a physical weight on his chest. Sarah would sometimes find him nodding off in his worn armchair, a book tented on his lap, the lamp still glowing. She'd gently wake him, her eyes holding a mix of concern and quiet admiration. "Go to bed, Roy," she'd whisper. But he knew going to bed meant losing precious time, losing ground. One particularly brutal Tuesday, the line had gone down twice, adding hours to their shift. Roy dragged himself home well past 11, his shoulders screaming, his mind a fog. David was still up, hunched over his geometry homework, a frustrated frown etched on his young face. "Can't get this, Dad," he mumbled, pushing a pencil through his hair. Roy wanted to help, to offer some profound insight, but his own brain felt like sloshing mud. He just grunted, patted David's shoulder, and stumbled into the kitchen to make a weak cup of instant coffee. The sight of his business books, stacked accusingly on the small kitchen table, was a punch to the gut. "What's the point?" A voice whispered in his ear, low and insidious. "You're too old, too tired, too ordinary." He stared at the page, words swimming before his eyes. He tried to focus, to force the meaning into his head, but it was like trying to catch smoke. He closed the book with a thud that echoed in the quiet house. For the first time since that night in the bathroom, he felt the old resignation creeping back, thick and suffocating. He thought about just giving it up, going to bed, sleeping until noon on his day off, letting the dream shrivel and die like all the others. "It's a young man's game, Roy," the voice sneered. "You had your chance. This is your life." He walked out to the garage, not because he intended to work, but because he needed to be somewhere else, anywhere but that kitchen table with its accusing books. The garage was dusty, still mostly a storage space for old tools, boxes of forgotten Christmas decorations, and David's outgrown bicycle. He ran a calloused hand over the cold metal of his old workbench, a relic from his father's days. It was piled with junk. For a fleeting moment, he saw it not as a workspace, but as a monument to unrealized ambition. His own, and perhaps his father's too. A wave of profound weariness washed over him, a bone-deep fatigue that went beyond the physical. It was the weariness of a man fighting a ghost, the ghost of who he used to be, the ghost of who he was afraid he'd always be. He leaned against the wall, breathing in the smell of oil and old wood. He closed his eyes. The easy path, the familiar path, beckoned. Just clock in, clock out, pay the bills, be content with enough. That was what he'd told himself for decades. But the thought of going back to just enough after having glimpsed something more felt like a betrayal. Not of some grand vision, but of that simple promise he'd made to himself. He remembered Emily's ambitious plans for her future, David's earnest questions about how things worked, Sarah's unwavering belief in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. He straightened up slowly, his back protesting. The garage might be a mess and his mind might be weary, but it wasn't over. Not yet. He took a deep breath, the scent of dust and old gasoline filling his lungs. It wasn't about understanding every single chart or theory in one night. It wasn't about being brilliant. It was about showing up. Again, even when it felt pointless, especially when it felt pointless. He cleared a small space on the workbench, pushing aside a rusty paint can and a tangled extension cord. He picked up a piece of scrap wood, a discarded 2x4, and a pencil. He didn't know what he was going to build yet, but he could draw. He could sketch. He could start to visualize. His hands, usually so adept at repetitive factory tasks, felt clumsy as he tried to put a nascent idea onto the wood. It was an awkward, almost childish drawing of a simple mechanism he'd imagined, something that could streamline a process he'd seen in one of the manufacturing books. It looked crude, unworkable. A wave of frustration threatened to overwhelm him. He gritted his teeth, erased a line, redrew it. It was far from perfect, far from a solution. But for the first time in hours, he wasn't just reading about building something. He was attempting to create something, however small and flawed. And in that small act, in that refusal to simply retreat, the insidious whispers of doubt began to recede, replaced by the quiet, familiar hum of his own stubborn heart. He was still in the ring, and he wasn't planning on throwing in the towel. The days after that first crude sketch blurred into a relentless rhythm. Roy still woke before the birds, but now his mornings didn't end with the factory whistle. They stretched into the garage, fueled by weak coffee and a stubborn, quiet defiance. He'd chip away at that initial idea, the one that looked like a child's scribble on scrap wood, breaking it down, rebuilding it in his mind, then in rough, makeshift models fashioned from PVC pipe and spare hardware. Some nights he'd stare at a half-finished jig, convinced it was all a fool's errand, the doubt pressing down like the weight of the old Pontiac parked just inches away. He'd almost quit a dozen times, the memory of his former self, the one content to just be a seductive whisper in his ear. But then he'd remember David struggling with a math problem or Emily talking about the competitive world of college, and he'd find a new surge of resolve. It wasn't about genius. It was about showing up. He started to see patterns in the manufacturing books he devoured, connecting the dots between obscure diagrams and the clanking machines on the factory floor. He wasn't just reading anymore, he was understanding. The words stopped being flat on the page and started to hum with possibility. He learned the language of gears and levers, tolerances and stresses. Sarah, his steady rock, was the first to notice the subtle changes. The light in the garage stayed on later and later. She'd wake to the faint, metallic clang of tools or the smell of wood dust clinging to his clothes. He was still tired, yes, profoundly so, but the weariness in his eyes had a different quality now. It wasn't the dull ache of resignation. It was the sharp-edged exhaustion of a man pushing against something, a man engaged in a fight he truly believed in. He'd still slump onto the couch, but instead of the remote, a grease-stained notebook would fall from his lap, filled with diagrams and calculations, the margins scrawled with his neat, deliberate handwriting. He started humming to himself sometimes, a low, tuneless murmur as he fixed a leaky faucet or changed a light bulb, a sound she hadn't heard from him in years. At the factory, the change was even more muted, barely perceptible. Roy still walked the line, performed his duties with quiet efficiency. But now his gaze wasn't vacant. He observed the machinery, the flow of materials, the subtle inefficiencies with a new intensity. He saw beyond the repetitive motions, dissecting processes in his mind, constantly asking, could this be better, faster, simpler? Once he even made a quiet suggestion to a younger supervisor about adjusting a jig's angle to prevent material waste. The supervisor, used to Roy's silence, blinked. You thought of that, Roy? Roy just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible shrug. The supervisor tried it. It worked. And for a fleeting moment, a spark of pride, something he hadn't felt from his work in decades, ignited deep inside him. He was still Roy, the quiet guy on the line, but something profound had shifted. He was no longer just a cog. He was a mind at work, a quiet engine of observation and thought, building something not just in his garage, but within himself. Weeks turned into months. The small bungalow, once just a place to sleep and eat, now pulsed with a new kind of energy, radiating from the garage. The air out there was thick with the scent of sawdust, cutting oil, and the faint, exciting tang of ozone from a small, second-hand welding machine Roy had painstakingly repaired. His initial crude drawings had blossomed into intricate blueprints, taped haphazardly to the walls, covered in annotations and revisions. He had begun to build, not just visualize. His niche product, born from countless hours of observation on the factory floor and late-night tinkering, was a small, robust connector, a clever solution to a common point of failure in industrial assembly lines. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't change the world overnight. But it was practical, durable, and surprisingly elegant in its simplicity. He'd made prototypes out of various materials, testing them with a homemade rig, breaking them, redesigning, endlessly refining. His hands, once calloused from repetitive grabbing and lifting, now bore a different kind of wear, nicks from stray saw blades, the faint burn marks of solder, the precise, almost surgical lines of a craftsman. He wasn't just a worker anymore, he was a maker. The self-doubt, though never entirely vanquished, had receded from a roaring tide to a persistent murmur. He'd learned to quiet it, to acknowledge its presence but refuse its counsel. His eyes, though still often tired, held a different light. They were sharper, more focused, less prone to staring blankly into the middle distance. When he spoke, it was still infrequent, but there was a new conviction in his voice, a quiet authority that came from deep learning and hard-won experience. At the dinner table, the conversations slowly changed. Roy wasn't just asking David about his homework. He was genuinely discussing the principles behind a physics problem, offering real-world examples from his burgeoning understanding of mechanics. He'd listened to Emily talk about her college courses, not just nodding, but asking insightful questions, drawing connections to his own studies. Sarah watched him, a slow smile spreading across her face. He was still her Roy, but it was a Roy she hadn't seen since they were young, full of quiet dreams and a boundless, unspoken potential. His shoulders seemed broader, his gait firmer. He carried himself with a new kind of certainty, a man who had stopped accepting his lot and started carving out his own. He was still getting his hands dirty, still working hard, but now he was working for himself, building something piece by painstaking piece, not just a product, but a new version of Roy, stronger, wiser, and quietly, powerfully in command. In command! His garage, once a place for forgotten tools and weekend chores, was now a buzzing hive of invention. He'd named his nascent company, Steady Hand Innovations, a nod to the meticulous care he'd always taken in his factory work, now applied to something of his own making. Products, small and ingenious, began to take shape, finding their way to a growing number of satisfied customers online. Roy wasn't rich, not by a long shot, but the bills were getting easier to manage, and more importantly, he felt a wealth he hadn't known existed. One evening after the whirring of machines had ceased, Sarah found him just staring at a blueprint, a slight smile on his face. "You did it, Roy," she whispered, her arm around his shoulder. He turned, his eyes deep with a quiet understanding. "Didn't feel like doing it most days, honey. Felt more like just not doing it. Every time I wanted to quit, every time the self-doubt whispered, I just told myself, show up, Roy, just for today, solve this one problem." It wasn't about being smart or having all the answers. It was just about showing up for myself again and again, and slowly those again and again started to build something. And that's the thing about Roy, he wasn't some prodigy.